Hello again and welcome. This is Module 3 called Setting Up the Project Environment. As you can see in this particular module, we're going to start off by looking at project information and the project statistics dialog box very briefly, but then spend most of the time here selecting the environment options. It would be helpful if you also have to hand during this module my accompanying exercise book. Go to exercise 4 and I've given you some screenshots which will help you learn as we go through this particular module. Now, as you know, I've arranged these modules in a fairly logical sequence so that you can learn step by step. So in fact, module 3 is indeed the first set of actions that you would normally take when setting up a brand new project file. However, most of this module I want to make sure that you understand most of the key commands and checkboxes that you'll find within the options dialog box. Okay, well, let's make a start. First things first, if you go and open up your project file, and I want you to open the file that I've included called module3_environment.mpp. That should look something like this. Now, this particular file contains various little scenarios here, one or two task scenarios that will help me to describe some of the various options we're going to look at. But the first thing you would want to do is go to the Project tab and click on the Project Information dialog box. And here what you would want to do is to set up the start date for your project. We'll keep that as the 16th. Set in the current date. As you can see, I'm actually recording this on the 17th of January. And the status date, which we will be discussing as part of this session. That's different to the current date, as I will explain later. Here you would set the calendar that you wish to drive the project. In this case, although you've got three options, 24 hours for those projects which are round the clock literally, or night shift, which of course you can modify and customize all of these, but the night shift gives you 2 shifts, as you might imagine, throughout the night, and the standard is what we'll leave here. Now, there's a priority field which is useful when you have got multiple projects, either within a program or more likely within a particular organization and group. And this is set between 1 and 1,000, so 500 is halfway. The only time you'd really want to use this is that if you did want to set priorities on certain projects against others which are running, possibly vying for the same resources. By having a project with a higher priority, then any spare resources would go first to that particular project. Other than that, I suggest you just leave it as 500 without making any changes. Now, notice here it says schedule from project start date. Well, that's probably the default setting that you'd want to keep, frankly. But how about this as a scenario? Your boss has come to you and said, well, I want you to produce a schedule, however, it must be in place on July the 30th for a certain exhibition. In which case you could input a schedule into Microsoft Project and then select project finish date, and in this case the start date is grayed out, but you can set whatever date it is that you wanted this particular project to finish on, July the 30th, and then when you press OK, what it would do if you had a real project in here, it would make the last task finish on the 30th of July. The value here is it would tell you when you need to start in order to meet the time constraint. A word of warning here, if you do this, use it only as a what-if scenario. Because if you leave this setting, Microsoft Project will calculate backwards and set all tasks to finish as late as possible rather than to start as early as possible. So I suggest you just use it as a what-if scenario. So I'm going to put this back to project start date starting on the 16th of January. Now, the other field that's quite important here is the statistics button here, because this will give you the overall statistics for the project. Here's the start, here's the finish, here's the duration, here's the amount of work hours, and there's no cost here because I haven't filled in any cost fields. I know we've looked at this already, but I just want to be complete so you understand that having set up the project information, you'd want to check the statistics regularly, particularly as you're developing the project and ultimately before you get it signed off, and of course regularly when you're tracking progress. There is a very useful report which captures this all on one sheet, and we'll be looking at that when we cover the reports in the later module. For now, we'll leave that exactly as it is. So now let's look at the options dialog box, and I want to run you through most of the settings in here that I think are important for you to know. We go to the backstage view, which is on the File tab here, and select Options here. Various different sections here. We'll stay on the General tab, of course, for the moment. Color scheme is silver. I think I would suggest you leave all of this pretty much as it is. The default view is the Gantt chart with the timeline shown. I've actually taken mine out for the moment. You'll remember we discussed that in the previous session. The date format. Now this is interesting. I've actually got a date format with time here. It might be appropriate to include the time of the day if, for example, you're working half days, or if certain members of your team want to record whether they worked in the morning or the afternoon. I would suggest the default setting here would be something like this. It's a fairly neat date format, so I'm going to leave mine as that. Personalize your copy of Microsoft Project. I've put my username in here and initials. You may find that yours only has the first initial of your first name, but you can indeed edit it to show your full initials if you wish. For example, if there was a Dennis on your resource team, the DGL would point out the U as a unique resource, as the initials are included within the various resource fields. So fairly straightforward, this one. Let's go straight to the display. Now, calendar type, I'm going to keep to the Gregorian calendar, as that's what I use in Europe and most likely what you may use in various parts of the world, but we do have two other types of calendar for those of you who wish to use them. I'll obviously stick to this. Now, currency symbol, what Microsoft Project doesn't do is do currency conversion, thankfully, because of the currency conversion changes from day to day, if not hour to hour. But what you can do here is to choose the cost fields, what symbol you wish to use. I'm sticking with British pounds here. The placement in this case is the symbol first, then the numeric value. The currency you can change, of course. If you're one of my colleagues in the US, then you would use the US dollar, of course. And you can decide whether you want to go down to 2 decimal digits, in the case of US, showing dollars and cents, of course. Something which I don't tend to use anymore, but you can add an entry bar, which you may have seen or indeed used in other applications of Microsoft Office. I'll just temporarily show it here so you can see what I'm talking about. I'll select yes, press OK, and you notice it's this little space up here. So if I clicked in on plan here, you could actually go and change this if you wished. If I wanted to edit it, I could go up here and change it and then click the check mark to agree it or cross to come out of it. I won't actually use that. As I said, it clutters the screen up in my opinion, so let me go and get rid of it. I suggest you leave all of these indicators and options as they are for the moment. So let's move on to schedule. Now, your default week starts on Monday, but you can set it to another day if you so wish. I've worked for companies where, for timesheet reasons, the first day of the week is indeed a Sunday, moving through to Saturday. Many others prefer to talk about the weekday rather than the weekend, so I'll keep mine on Monday, but you can indeed change it. For those that you have a fiscal year, particularly where projects are traversing the fiscal year boundary, it might be useful to actually change the fiscal year by having January. It's in perfect harmony with the annual calendar, of course. If, for example, April is a key date, often in Europe, April is used as a fiscal start, although it could be any other month, you'll be telling Microsoft Project when indeed you want costs for fiscal years to be calculated. I'll keep this as January. Now the default start time and the hours per day is all to do with the calendars, of course, and in the next module I'm going to be going into this in detail, so I'll skip this for now. But just to remind you, 8 hours a day starting at 8 o'clock and finishing at 5 o'clock is the default calendar, with an hour off for lunch, giving you 8 hours a day and 20 working days, of course, per month. Coming to the schedule, show scheduling messages. Certainly while you're learning, sometimes they can be annoying. I would suggest we leave them on for the remainder of these modules, but you may well find once you get familiar with Microsoft Project you wish to turn them off. Show assignments units as a percentage or as a decimal. This is fairly straightforward. I'll keep it as percentage, but I'll show you where you might see that if I can just temporarily close this down here. If I happen to go on task A, which I know has got Dave on it, can you see Dave's assignment units are shown as 100%. Yeah. Go back to File, Options, Schedule, and show this as decimal. I think you know what's coming. That's going to be showing it as 1. And if Dave was 50%, then this would show as 0.5 rather than 50%. I'll keep it as percentage for the remainder of these modules. New tasks are created auto-scheduled. You know they are auto-schedule and manually scheduled tasks. Let me just deal with that now. I'll keep it as auto-scheduled if I may. For other reasons, I've got a couple of manually scheduled tasks here called Manual 1 and Manual 2. Can you see that if it is manually scheduled, it has a different look and feel to a standard looking bar? What this actually means is that whenever you set a task to manual, it will stay exactly where it's put at the start of the project date. The only way you can then move it to where you want it to place in time is to enter a start date or a finish date. Because it's manually scheduled, it'll go to that point. Now, one of the things that I've done in the past is I've used Microsoft Project through an overhead display at a meeting to produce a very rough first draft plan of major task areas, and I've had them set manually, and I've merely picked them up, getting the 4-pointed cross, and moved them roughly in time to where they need to be. Each task may have been several weeks long, and it was just to get a rough picture of how long the project might need to be. But I would suggest that you keep all of your tasks to automatically scheduled. What that means is that when you create a link from one task to another, the task will automatically start as soon as possible, but following the linked logic, in this case of finish to start, which is why it starts on that date there. Notice that auto-scheduled tasks obey the calendar, whereas as we shall see, when you have a manually scheduled task, you can literally put it where you wish, including partway through a weekend, which I'll describe later. So I would recommend most strongly that by default you have your tasks set to auto-schedule. So going back to Options, Schedule, new tasks are auto-scheduled. If they're not auto-scheduled, or whether they are and you don't wish them to be for whatever reason, if you double click on any task name, I'll just choose Plan and go to the General tab, you can see you've got a little radio button here where you could change it from auto to manual or vice versa. I'll leave this as it is for now. Okay, back then to Options, Schedule. So we've covered auto-schedule. Auto-scheduled tasks are scheduled from the project start date. I would suggest you leave that. In other words, wherever the start date is, all of the tasks will lay in line until you link them. Duration is entered in days and work is entered in hours. These are the default settings, and I would suggest you leave them where they are. But suppose you were initially planning a very large project, large in terms of time. You might want to have the units shown, and we're talking about these units here, in the duration column, for example, as showing in weeks. Perhaps you're talking about a 3-week task, a 10-week task, and weeks would make most sense rather than days. Whatever you set here, you can still set days, hours, or minutes if you wish. Project will automatically convert it back. It's merely the default setting. Let me just show you quickly duration sets, for example, in weeks. Press OK. Nothing happens to anything already scheduled, But if I added a new task in here, you'll see it's calibrated in weeks, 1 day being 0.2 of a week. And as I turn this up, it's weeks we're talking about. Okay, let me just undo that, and I'll go back to options and turn that back to standard. So duration is entered in days. I suggest you leave that and work in hours. Frankly, most of the time that when you're estimating work, you're thinking in terms of hours. It's the best way to come up with a realistic plan. After all, you would ask an individual who will be working on a task, how many hours will this take, rather than how many days it will take. Default task type is in terms of fixed units. Please note there are 3 types: fixed units, fixed duration, and fixed work. And I want to discuss briefly all of these now. I am actually going to cover this when we discuss work in a later module, but I believe you ought to have an understanding of this before we get there, otherwise you'll be forever looking at these and wondering what's going on. So let me just go through this first. I'll leave this as fixed unit, and I'm going to use this lay cable task as an example. You'll notice I've got the Gantt chart view here. Having the task tab selected, I've selected details here. If you remember, that adds it in. This is useful because I can look at particular tasks up here and look at the resources assigned here. Alright, let me just pull this back and discuss exactly what we mean by fixed units, fixed work, and fixed duration. It all comes down to a formula which is embedded in Projex, and I've included this here. Duration equals, or better still, is proportional to the amount of work being undertaken divided by the amount of units. Now units, just think of those as people for the moment, if you will. 1 person full-time will be 1 unit. 2 people full-time will be 2 units. A person working 50% will be 0.5 of a unit. So that the duration of a task is proportional to the amount of work. If you double the amount of work, keeping the units constant, then the duration will be twice as long. But it's inversely proportional to units. If you've got work being given to 1 person, say 20 hours, if 2 people can equally share it, and that is a good point, whether that's possible always, then of course you could get the work done in half the time, because in which case they share the work between them. So this is the basic law of nature, if you will, that's inbuilt. With that in mind, what Microsoft Project needs to do is to reflect reality in terms of tasks in the real world. I'm sure you've come across tasks which by their very nature are a fixed duration. An obvious one here is waiting for cement to dry or paint to dry. No matter how many painters are watching it, it still takes the same amount of time to dry. Or you may have some automatic test that needs to be carried out on a piece of software, and this test needs to be exercised for 48 hours. Well, no matter how many engineers are gathering data from the test, it's still going to take 48 hours. In which case, you'd want to set such a task to fixed duration. Now let me just give you a glimpse into this here. Double click on the task name and you'll get the task information box up. Now if you go to the Advanced tab, you'll see here the task type is set, and by default Microsoft Project sets it to fixed units. But if, for example, I set this to fixed duration, like so, and clicked OK, that means that this task is going to remain at 5 days, unless of course I overwrote it. See, this is the important point I want to put across. It's only the calculation. Doesn't mean you can't change this. It means that the only variables are work and units. If you change the work amount, this would still stay at 5 days. Think about it. There's only 3 variables here. Duration is not going to get recalculated. That's really what fixed duration means here. So if you change the work, it'll adjust the units to keep the duration equal to 5 days. If you found you had more people and you put more people on it, you change the units, again it won't recalculate duration because it's a fixed duration task. It'll reset the amount of work so that if you've got 4 people, the duration stays the same and the work is adjusted. Let's have a little look at that. If I'm just going to pull this up here so you can see more easily. Here's the task, and here's Jim. You can see here Jim's got 40 hours of work and he's on this task on his own. Fine. I'm just going to double click on this, and what I'm going to do is to go to the Resources tab, and here you can see Jim. If I click underneath it and add someone else, say Frank, press OK, what's happened? It still stays at 5 days, and what it's done is it's got 2 people by default full-time, so they're both doing 40 hours a week. I'll come to how you can change this in a minute, but can you see it hasn't touched the duration? Let me take this off here. I'm just going to press delete. Don't worry, that hasn't got rid of Frank, it's merely unassigned him from this particular task. Press OK, and we're back to Jim. Let's reset this to a different type of task. Notice I can also change it here. So we're back to fixed units, which is the default setting. Let me again just add Frank and watch what happens. Click OK. You'll see that it's exactly the same as fixed duration because of something called effort driven, which I'll come to in a second. But suppose here, now we've got fixed units. I took Frank and I reduced his work required on this task, remember this is planned work, to 20 hours. Again, I'll press OK. Notice now, again the task duration stays the same, because why? Because there's 2 people on this, and the task can't finish until the final piece of work is being done. So if you will, Jim, to use this word, it's not the right one, is on the critical path of this task. In other words, it can't finish until Jim's finished. What will happen is Frank will work 20 hours up to the Wednesday lunchtime and then do no more work, and Jim will continue then on his own. Alright, let me take Frank away again from this particular task so we can start back from the beginning, and I'll change this to fixed work. Now let's see what happens when I add Frank. Press the OK button. Can you now see, since it says, oh well, there was 40 hours work on this, now we've added Frank, they're going to share the work, and Microsoft Project has automatically set them to 20 hours each, thus bringing the duration down to 2.5 days. Alright, so in each case, the duration equals work divided by the units will be the driving formula that lays behind it, with certain constraints as we've seen. Again, I'm going to cover this all later. All I want to do is to give you an appreciation of what's going on here. Let me take Frank off and I'll show you this. Press OK. So back here, File, Options, Schedule, and here's the default fixed units. So you could change the default task type for when you enter new tasks here. I'm suggesting you keep it as fixed units, knowing that if certain tasks are different, you can indeed change them if necessary. But I want to, while we're talking about this, is discuss this little box called New Tasks Are Effort Driven. Okay? The only time this has an effect is when you add resources. Whether this is checked or otherwise, it will not have any effect to the task duration, work or effort when you first assign resources. It's only having first assigned them, you then modify at a later point. Maybe 3 seconds later, realize you can add a second person, or you change something. The effort driven will change the formula. Effort really means here work driven. So since this has been turned off, let me now turn it on. We're keeping the fixed units as default, and I'll press OK. And let's look at this same scenario again. Lay cable, 5 days with Jim. Jim's already assigned, so whether we didn't have Jim or we did have Jim, it wouldn't make any difference. Let me just take him away to show you. So let's just add Jim back and press OK. No problem. If I now add Frank and press OK, again it knows there's 40 hours, so it's divided it between the resources. If I add a third person, in this case, say Steve, again press OK, again it keeps dividing the work because it's effort driven. irrespective of whether it's fixed duration, fixed work and fixed units. At least that's partially true. You see, for the fixed duration and fixed units type tasks, Project assumes by default that each task is not effort driven. As you've just seen, we can turn on the effort driven setting if desired, or if you choose fixed duration or fixed units type tasks. With the fixed work task type selected, the effort driven is turned on automatically and can't be turned off. As you've seen, when I set the task type to fixed work, when I added extra resources, automatically the work was shared. Now, I only wanted to touch on this in this session because we will deal with it again when we look at resources. And so if you're still not quite clear, don't worry too much. It's just the settings I want to get out of the way in terms of options. Let me pull this back a little so we can see more of the top screen. Go back to File, Options, Schedule. So we've covered this, and new tasks are effort driven. The next piece says auto link inserted or moved tasks, and that is checked. I actually prefer this to be unchecked. Let me show you why. I'm going to press OK. I've used this simple little model here with 3 tasks: plan, design and test. Let's suppose that I suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I've gone straight from design to test. I need to insert build. Well, if I click on test, and on the task tab, if I go to task and click here, I've got a new task that's been inserted. No matter what it's called, can you see it set it back at the default start date of the project and not linked it? And I think that's the safe option. You see, if you insert a new task at a certain point vertically in your task list, who says it has to be linked from this to this to this? You might want this to be linked from here, and from here to go somewhere else. So sitting it back like a little orphan at the beginning is the best default setting, in my opinion. Let me just take this out. I'll just undo and show you this again, but this time with auto link selected. And you'll see why I don't like this. If I now again go to the task and insert a task, can you see it's automatically put it between the task above it and the task below it? Now that might be quite convenient if generally that's what you want, but suppose you did that quickly and you were modifying other parts of the schedule and you'd forgotten that this doesn't want to be here. You've now got a link which is in error and you may not spot it. Whereas if it sat here as an orphan, you could easily spot it as something you need to schedule into the project itself. Okay, so I'm going to undo and make sure. I could do undo again, but I just want you to see that I want this unchecked. The next thing we want to talk about is the split in progress tasks. I'll leave that unchecked and show you what I'm talking about here. Let's take these 2 tasks here, task A and task B. Let's assume that task A has started. Let's put in, say, 40% of work. Okay. Now, for whatever reason, we could start work on task B. However, there's a finish to start dependency, so this can't start until this is finished. But it may well be we've got resources freed up, which means we could actually start task B. Here, there's an opportunity. Now, a good way of showing this and demonstrating it is to go to a different view rather than the Gantt chart. Either of the usage screens, we'll use the task usage. Remember, it's task A and task B here. Let's just scroll up so you can see it nicely in the time frame. Here we have it. Here's task A. I've got actual work and planned work shown here and percentage complete. And here's task B, planned to start in the following week. Let's suppose that Dave has realized that he can in fact put in 8 hours here on task B. Let's enter it like so. Let's go back to the Gantt chart and see what has happened. You see, it's pulled task B forward to today's date to show it starting now. Well, that's one option, of course. You could argue correctly that therefore task B has started but it might be better to show that in actual fact we ought to honour the finish the start relationship, but show that some of task B has already been undertaken. So let me use the undo button as a quick way of going back here. Let's go to File, Options, Schedule, and this time check the box called Split in Progress Tasks. Go through the same thing again. Here's task B. Let's suppose in this particular day here, Dave can do 8 hours of work, and there it is. Let's go and see what Project has now done by looking at the Gantt chart. Can you see it as split in progress tasks, showing that in effect it's still due to start next week, but we've done 1 day of it already. Notice it hasn't got longer. It's still a 5-day task. It just has 4 days planned for next week rather than the 5 days due to the fact we've done 1 now. So it's your choice whether you want to show the fact that if you have the opportunity to start tasks earlier that have some link between them, a successor-predecessor link, then you can check that box to make this happen. Okay, let's move on. Going back then to File, Options, Schedule, we now understand what split in progress tasks mean. The next one I want to deal with is called Update Manually Scheduled Tasks when Editing Links. And to remind you, here's what we're talking about, and here are 2 manually scheduled tasks. So let's read that again. We'll keep it unchecked for the moment and see the effect. So let's take these 2 manually scheduled tasks and I'll now link them. In other words, I'm editing the original links. I'm making this a finish to start relationship. Notice that this stays exactly where it is. In other words, it doesn't move out because I've got that box unchecked. So it does not update the manually scheduled tasks when I've undertaken a link edit. Let's undo that and see the effect when I have a couple of manually scheduled tasks. Let's go to Schedule, and this time I'll check this box and see the difference. I'm sure you know what's coming. I click there to there, and sure enough, now it does indeed respect the link type that of finish to start in this case. So that's what that means. A very similar setting now. Tasks will always honour their constraint dates. Let's go and find the option. Tasks will always honour their constraint dates. We've got it unchecked. Let's leave it that way and see what happens. In other words, tasks will not always honour their constraint dates, as you might imagine. Now on this second task here, I've put a constraint date by going to the Advanced tab, start no later than the 23rd of January, which happens to be this date here. In other words, this can't start any later than that. Suppose this first task takes 7 days instead of 5, a delay for whatever reason. Now, of course, you see, this pushes this out, showing that it is starting later. Now, you might argue that this is real world, and therefore, for whatever reason, if we can't start this until that's finished, because it's delayed, this has rightly shown that. But it is broken, if you will, the must start no later than. And what Microsoft Project does, it puts this little warning here in the very useful indicator column. Doesn't do anything, doesn't calculate, it merely advises you that this task has now broken its start no later the constraint. Let's now go and undo that, and this time go to Options, Schedule, and check the box that says tasks will always honour their constraint dates. If you like, it's making it a hard constraint. Again, let's now update this. Imagine it takes 7 days instead of 5. And the planning wizard reminds you that this causes a schedule conflict. You've got the option to cancel if you did this by mistake, but I want to continue to show you what that checkbox does. And there we have it. And you can see this will still no longer start any later than the 23rd, but it shows quite rightly that it's still a finish to start link, but this has now been violated. And again, if this can't start for good practical reasons any later than that, then at least it reminds you that in order to meet the schedule, this will remain where it is. So there we have it. Again, all Microsoft Project is trying to do here is to give you flexibility when it comes to scheduling and constraints. Okay, next up, there's a rather strangely sounding little checkbox called Keep Task on Nearest Working Day when changing to automatically scheduled mode. Let's go find it. And by the way, I've skipped these two since we've already covered them and they're fairly obvious. Show that scheduled tasks have estimated durations. It does that, if you remember, by putting a question mark after their durations when you first enter them, and that new scheduled tasks have estimated durations. You'll remember that every time we enter a new task, it gets a question mark opposite to remind you that this is estimated. So here we go. Keep task on nearest working day when changing to automatically scheduled mode. All right. This, as you can see, is a manually scheduled task, and manually scheduled tasks can start on any day. And I've made this start on a Saturday, which is a non-working time, but that's okay because you can do that. So let's now double click this and change it from a manually scheduled task to an auto-scheduled one, and we can do this on the General tab here by clicking that radio button there and press OK. Let's see what happens. Watch carefully here. Can you see that? It moved it out to the nearest working day. In this case, since this finished on a Friday night, the nearest was the following Monday. All right. Next one, updating task status updates resource status. Again, let me show you where that is first. Going to the Schedule tab. Just scrolling down a little. Updating task status updates resource status. We've got it checked at the moment. Let's see exactly what that means, and then I'll uncheck it and show you the difference. This task here is called testing. We've got it down here. We can see that a young lady called Sue is working on it. It's a 5-day task. Sue is working 40 hours. Let's suppose that Sue has advised us that the task is 50% complete, like so. Press OK. Notice what it's done is that it has set the task status to 50% complete. That's the progress line. Okay, if you don't believe me, click on it there and you'll see it says 50% complete. But what it's automatically done, it's recognized the work being done on it, Sue in this case, and it's set her to 20 hours actual, 20 hours remaining, which is 50% of the work. So please be aware that Microsoft Project has two percentage complete fields. One is task percentage complete and the other is work percentage complete. If you go to the work table, let's go to View, Tables, and choose Work, and I'll just temporarily pull this over here. You'll see there is the percentage work complete. Yeah. Now that got automatically updated as a result of the setting that we've set in options. Let me go back and put the original entry table back in, if I may. Just adjust this so it looks sensible. Okay, so there we have it. Let's now go back and show the opposite effect. Options, Schedule, let's uncheck that. I think you know what's going to happen now. If I now double click on the task, or let's just set this back to 0, otherwise you'll think I'm cheating in some way. Okay, so there we have it, Sue, 40 hours full time. If I now double click and set this to 50% complete, press OK, notice that shows 50% complete, but Sue's work is unaffected. The advantage to this, of course, is that not always is a percentage of a task complete a linear relationship to the work. Take this 5-day task. You might find that by Wednesday lunchtime, although you're 50% through the task duration, you may have done 60% of the work, in which case you could either update the work field, or in the case of this split screen with Sue here, I could actually adjust the work to the ratio that I desire. In other words, it's unlinked the calculation between task duration and work duration. Your choice. Okay, let's go back now to the options, file and options, and schedule. Well, there's two remaining here. Inserted projects are calculated like summary tasks. That obviously deals with multiple projects, so I won't cover that here. And actual costs are always calculated by project. I think you should keep those checked, otherwise you'll have to hand crank all of the cost fields. And default fixed cost accrual. This refers to each task. Whatever the costs are on a task, you can choose to have them all captured at the start of each task in full, or at the end of each task in full, or the default setting is prorated or pro rata or per day. We'll keep that as shown here, as I think it's the most useful way of capturing costs. For example, if you've had a 4-week task, which is quite a big one, then it might be quite important to actually see by the end of each week exactly what had been spent on it. So whether the tasks are that long or whether they're shorter, I think prorated is probably the default setting that should be used here. Well, that brings us to the end of the schedule section. Let's now go on to proofing, which is fairly straightforward. I believe you should leave all these exactly as they are. Here we're talking about correcting spelling, ignoring words in uppercase. And when you carry out spell checking on project, of course it can only actually spell check text fields, and here you have them by default all checked, which means any text fields within your project file will be checked when you use the spelling checker. Straightforward. Go to the save section. Here's the default location on my particular PC. Yours will be different, of course. You can auto save and check how many minutes you want to save it for. Mine's switched off at the moment, but I would suggest perhaps it would be a good idea for you to auto save every so many minutes. I won't do it now because it may interfere with my recording. And here's where you store your templates. If you remember the previous module, we discussed the use of templates. That brings to language, again very straightforward. I'm obviously speaking in English, so I'll keep it as is there. You may wish to change it. And that brings us neatly to advanced, which is pretty much the last major one. I will check out the remaining groups, but advanced is the last one we'll spend a little time with. Starting at the top then, set auto filter on for new projects. If you're familiar with Excel, you'll know about auto filter. You'll notice at the top of each column you'll have a little down arrow or a little triangle. Clicking on that, you can use your typical auto filter fields. I won't look at that now, but I'm sure you understand what that is. Won't bother about project web applications. Straight to planning wizard then. I think you should keep all of these on. Certainly I will while we're going through these training videos, but you may well find that when you're familiar with project that these get in the way and slow down your work. Indeed, be careful right from the beginning. The advice they're giving you should be read, of course, but you'll often find that the advice they suggest, and that's all it is, should not be followed. You'll often have more than one choice where you can choose to ignore the advice. General options for the project. Automatically add new resources and tasks. If you don't have this checked, as an example, if you added a new resource, you'll get a dialog box come up which asks you, would you like to add this to the resource pool? So keep it on to stop that. Default standard rate, I'm leaving mine at 0, but when you come to run this in your organization, if you do have some fairly common charge rates within your organization or overtime rates, it would be a good idea to set these to it, simply so that when you add resources to your project, they'll automatically be set at that particular hourly rate. It just saves you a bit of time if that was worth doing. We'll leave hours as 0. Edit, I suggest you keep all of these as they are. You certainly want to have drag and drop features, as well as being able to edit directly in the cell. Again, with the display sections here, I suggest you leave them all exactly where they are. You'd want to show the status bar. You'd certainly, for example, want to show the scroll bars. They're absolutely vital in helping you to use Microsoft Project in an effective manner. So leave those as they are. The next bit talks about display options. Notice, for example, in duration, the default is days and it's shown as days. That's because here we said show it as the word day rather than dy or even d. You may choose to change that, particularly if you have lots of columns, by setting some of these to the smaller settings like m for minutes. It can save you a little bit of column space and you can pack more in. I suggest again you leave these exactly as they are. Add space before the label, yes, so that you can see clearly that's the number 5 and the units are days as an example. Cross-project linking options for this project. This again refers to multiple projects, which I won't be covering here, but so it makes sense to have these on if indeed at some point you would be showing external projects. Then seeing the successors and predecessors as an example and links between them would make good sense, so we'll leave those as default. Earned value, again I'm not covering this at this point, so that we'll leave this as is. Notice that you can have two ways of calculating earned value. One is using the percentage complete and the other is physical percentage complete. So we'll leave both of these as default. But finally, the bit that I think is interesting is calculation options for this project. Now notice here you've got some indented checkboxes. The reason for that is you tend to use these together, like you'd normally have this checked and that checked, although as you can see you don't have to. And similarly, when we look at these, you can have this and you'd normally have both of those checked together. However, first I need to describe exactly what this means. Now, this would make a little bit more sense if they used commas within the statement. If they'd have put move end of completed parts after status date, comma, back to status date, it would read a little better. Let me explain what these mean. First of all, I'll switch them off and I'll just demonstrate with the next couple of tasks. So let's just scroll this up here, and I've used these two sets here to describe these two checkboxes. You'll find that in actual fact they're not as flexible as you might think. You tend to have to use them in pairs. Now the first one says move end of completed task parts after status date back to status date. Notice here, here's the date that I'm actually recording this, so let's keep an eye on this orange coloured line. Here's two tasks. I've got a resource on this second one, Ron, and it's called a task in the future. So here we are, and here it is in the future. Suppose for whatever reason we suddenly realise that we could do some work on this right now, even though we haven't finished the current task. So let's simulate this. I've got a split screen by just setting percentage complete here. Let's make it 40%. Click the OK button and see what happens. You see, by default, even though this is today, and we're actually saying, as of today, we have completed 40% on this task in the future, it correctly sets this to 40%, but it leaves it in the future. In other words, the actual work is shown as if it happened next Monday and Tuesday, instead of back here in the middle of this week. Now that might be fine for you. Maybe it doesn't matter, but if it does, you need to do something about it. Let me press the undo button and we'll redo this again, but this time, Options, Advanced, scroll to the bottom. Let's check these two together, because I want to show you there's a bit of redundancy here. So I've checked move end of completed parts after status date, comma, back to status date, and move start of remaining parts back to status date. Again, if you're like me, you need to see this to understand what they're really saying. Press OK, and let's go through the same thing again. I'll click on this task in the future, keep an eye on these, and I'll set this to 40% complete. Can you see, although I've given you two options here, I've checked and move start of remaining parts back to status date. Instead of leaving it out here, it's pulled, first of all it's shown correctly that here's the work we've actually done and the days on which we've done it, but it's taken the remaining piece and it's moved the remaining parts back to the status date. So there's the point of doing both of those. Let's undo it again. Go File, Options, Advanced, and we'll uncheck this and you'll see something interesting. Watch again as I set this to 40% complete. Can you see whether that second one was selected or not? It still sends it back to the status date. Again, that may not be a problem. What you're saying is that originally we had scheduled for this to start next week. But because we've already started on it, by clicking both of those buttons, Microsoft Project assumes you'll now continue on with it. So it's rescheduled it, so it will now finish earlier since you started on it earlier. Okay, let's look again by undoing this. Go back to File, Options, and do you remember when we looked at the Schedule tab? There was a little box that said Split in Progress Tasks. Well, it's unchecked at the moment. If I check it, press OK, now go through the same options again with the Advanced tab. Watch carefully. We've got Move End of Completed Parts After Status Date back to the status date. We'll do that so you can see that happen. It splits the task and it reschedules the remaining piece yet to be done next week. Can you see the fundamental difference here? It's acknowledged we've done this bit now, but Project, now you've told it it can split in progress tasks, says, well, in that case, we'll leave the remainder of it to occur next week as was expected. Again, I'll undo that. This time I'll select File, Options, Advanced, and we'll check both of them. You'll see there's absolutely no difference. Click on here, go to 40%, click OK. Same thing happens. So fundamentally, what I'm trying to teach you here is that although I've shown you two options, and you have indeed got two checkboxes, you can have this one on its own or both together. There is a fundamental difference about what happens whether or not, and here's the point I want to make, going back to the schedule, you check the box that says Split in Progress Tasks. That's the one. So you can see here, hopefully, that there is some amount of redundancy here. If you have them split, you can get situations like this. If you have the option set up so that in progress tasks can't split, it will indeed pull it back whether or not you've got this particular checkbox selected. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the next pair, which says Move Start of Remaining Task Parts Before Status Date Forward to Status Date. Okay, very similar to the two above. Let me demonstrate. So the first is Move Start of Remaining Task Parts Before Status Date Forward to Status Date. Let me first of all show you what this looks like with both those switched off. Go into Advanced again. I've unselected both of those options, but do note, because this is important, that I have allowed Project to split in progress tasks. If I now just, let's imagine 10%, we're actually done on this. With everything switched off, here we are today, and a task in the past that we've done some work on, Project shows it as if it happened back on Monday, rather than at today's date, because you haven't got either of these selected. Let me undo that. I think you know what's going to happen next. Go to Options, Advanced, and I'll check Move Start of Remaining Parts Before Status Date Forward to the Status Date. Let's see if that happens, shall we? What's happened here, you see, Move Start of Remaining Task Parts, that's this, that happened before the status date, forward to the status date. So it's acknowledging that you did this back on Monday. However, the remainder of this task will now be continued with, as of now, the status date. Let's undo that, and I'll show you the final setting. File, Options, Advanced, and this time, so we're going to do two things here. Not only are we going to move the remaining parts back to today's date, but we'll also bring with it the end of the completed parts forward to the status date. Let's see what that looks like. Click on this, set 10%, bingo. Can you see the difference? It left it back here in the previous setting with just this selected, but with both of these selected, it moves the whole thing. It assumes, well, what you're saying is you've worked on this today as of the status date, and therefore you'll finish it off, so this will now show the new setting. So these last 4 parts are fairly wordy, and I don't think you should worry too much about them at this early juncture. After all, we haven't even covered all the aspects of creating tasks and resources. But when you come to the tracking section, you may well want to go back and re-watch this video again, just to remind yourself of some of the aspects we talked about here. Remember, if it's not important in your project for the project file to accurately replicate the very day on which stuff happens, then you don't need to worry about any of this. You may just be running a project where, as long as you can show when tasks started and finished, but when the work occurred and in what particular day isn't that important, then you wouldn't need to bother with these. Okay, let's scroll down. Let's now look at this next one, which is edits to total task percentage complete will be spread to the status date. I've got 2 identical tasks here, one with Frank on it and one with Tony on it, just to help you identify them. They're both 5 days long. Notice that the status date is here, and I want to now show you the differences between these two. The best view to show this, because this refers to percentage complete of the task work, is in a time and work based view. So I'm going to get rid of the split screen by double clicking on that. Remember, one task is called status date deselected, the other is status date selected. I'm going to go to the views here and choose the task usage view. Let me scroll down so you can see it. Can you see? Here's the 2 tasks, and there's the resources assigned to it. Here's the 8 hours per day for that particular task, and here's the 8 hours a day for this particular task. Identical, of course, for each of the resources, since it's 1 person per task full time. You may notice here, unlike your screen if you're following me along, that I've got a field called percentage complete. How did I do that? Well, if you right click, you'll find that I've got percentage complete added, whereas you don't. Let me show you how I selected it by me unselecting it, and we'll start over. What I did is I right click and went to detailed styles. Scroll down and find percentage complete. P for percentage. There. And I show it by adding it to the options. And press OK. Now you can see I've got exactly the same task and resources, but for each I've got an extra row called percentage complete. A little bit of customizing. I've merely done that so I can show you clearly what's going on here. Let's start with the task where I will deselect this particular option. So go to File, Options, Advanced, scroll down. Edits to total task percentage complete will be spread to the status date. I'm unchecking that. In other words, that is not true. Press OK. Let's see what happens when I make this task a percentage complete. Let's choose 70%. I'm double clicking on the task name, choose 70%, and press OK. Can you see it's just taken the 70%, 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 10, and spread it across the task up to today's date. So let's do exactly the same thing so you can compare the two with the second one, but this time to select that option. File, Option, Advanced. There, I've selected it. Press OK. Double click on the task name and set it to 70% just like before. Press OK. There. It's taken the 70%, 23%, 23%, 23%, and divided it equally across it, but up to the status date, which is 1 day earlier than the actual date. So let me summarize what's happened here. Again, it's quite a detailed demonstration I'm giving you here, and something which you won't fully appreciate till we cover tracking in a much later module. But what's going on here, you're merely saying, I've set a status date, and I want the project file for this particular task to show that it's 70% of the work has been done by the status date, not up to today's date. In other words, this was the status as of the day before, because that's what I've done with this project file. Whereas if you don't select that, it'll take whatever today's date is, wherever it cuts the task, and take that 70% percentage complete and spread it across the task up to today's actual date. That's the only difference, as you can see. Okay, let's now go back and choose the Gantt chart file again, and I'll just finish off with the final settings and we're done. So let's go to File, Options, Advanced. Right, we've covered this. Let's uncheck that. You've only got two here, which I just want to briefly mention. Calculate multiple critical paths. It may well be, for example, in your project, if you have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and you're in the middle of one of those stages, you might want Project to show the critical task for that stage only. I'm not going to demonstrate that, but just be aware that setting is here. What I would like to demonstrate, because it is quite useful, is this last little button that says tasks are critical if slack is less than or equal to, and by default it's shown as 0. Just live with that for the moment so I can show you what I'm talking about. I've got a very simple little set of tasks here which I've linked together. So that we can see the critical path, we need to turn it on. So far, apparently, all tasks are non-critical. Well, that's the default setting, but if you go to Format, there's a button here called Critical Tasks. Now what this will do is, it will add in the format for any tasks that are critical, and it will make them red. And you can see in this very simple model, I've set it up so that one task is not critical. Now remember that the critical path is the longest path in a project. And in this particular example here, these are clearly critical tasks, but this task isn't. But how close is it to being on the critical path? Only 1 day. If I made this 4 days long, it too would be critical. So I ask you, in the bigger picture of a project, where you've got some tasks that are very near to being critical, you might look at this and say, that's not that important, it's non-critical, these are the ones I'll focus on. But this only wants to delay by 24 hours, and you've got yourself a problem. So if we now go back to Options, choose Advanced, and put in here, let's say, I'll just use 1 day as that will make my point. But you might say that any task in your project with a slack that's 2 days or less is quite close enough to the critical path and you want to see them as critical. I'll just choose 1 and press OK. Can you see now that this is shown as red? Although it's not critical by the mathematical calculation, it's so nearly critical that it would remind you that this also needs to be carefully managed in order to make sure that your project comes in on time. So a useful feature for the remainder of these modules, I'm going to set that back to 0, but it could be useful when you get back in the office and actually use this application for your real projects. Okay, well that finishes off the Advanced tab. Now just to complete this video, let's select File, Options, and this time to quickly go through the remaining ones. You won't need to change them, but I just need to show them to you for completeness. First of all, Customize ribbon. What we're obviously talking about here are these up here. You have a selection of tabs, you have groups, and you have individual commands. You'll notice here I've got the Project tab selected, and the first group is Insert, the second is Properties, the third is Schedule, and so on. You can see it here, replicated, Project, Insert, Properties, Schedule. So this is the structure you've got by default. The idea being here is that if you decided to modify this and customize it, you could do so. Again, within your organization, I caution you to deviating from a standard layout. But for example, if you wanted email added to one of these, you could click here, select one of these and press the add, and you'd have email added as an extra icon within the appropriate group. As you can see, you can set up your own new groups, so you could add group sections if you wished, and you can import and export such tabs to other users of Microsoft Project. For example, if you had a third party that was responsible for some aspect of the project and you wanted them to have exactly the same layout as you could do this here. But this is really an advanced feature, and I would suggest, please, that you leave it exactly as it is. In a similar way, Quick Access Toolbar. Can I remind you, that's this little piece up here. It's just got save, undo and redo, and that's probably good for most things you'd want. But if one of these you would find useful because you use it regularly, again similarly you could click on it, press add, and that would be added to the Quick Access Toolbar. Again, I suggest you leave it exactly as it is. Add-ins, if you have any, they'd be noted here, and Trust Center to do with privacy. You're familiar with these last two commands in terms of general Microsoft Office applications. So there we have it. Well, that brings us nicely to the end of this particular session. That's the Module 3 environment. So thank you for your attention, and we'll meet again on the next module, which is going to be looking at the various calendars.